The truth is, I don't really make video games for the love of games. I actually make video games for the hatred of the things that are not being done. And that's really the truth of what drives me in the journey of creating a game like Fractured Blooms. Fractured Blooms is a game that is very angry. It is a game that's filled with frustration. It is a game filled with stress and hate, and one that is built with a lot of raw emotions, a raw power that comes with it.
I sit at the front of the dinner table where he used to be.
My name is Z. I am the founder and executive director at Serenity Forge, and I'm also the game director of Fractured Blooms. Fractured Blooms is a farming sim, a cooking sim, a life sim, but as you keep on playing, you kind of notice that it's a little bit of psychological horror as well. The game is actually one that's filled with tons of layers. It's a very deep game. It's very nuanced. In fact, it is actually a game that is inspired by a true story, a story based on my family as well as the people around us.
I just woke up. Today is October 31st, Friday, and it's Halloween. And I'm kind of dying. I have extremely low platelets in my blood, which means if I get a cut right now, it would not heal, and I would probably bleed to death.
So due to my near-fatal illness when I was 18 years old and surviving that, luckily, I almost feel like I'm living on borrowed time. Sometimes that kind of gives me a very different perspective in how I should be spending my time and the time of others as well. One of the first games that I made was a game called Loving Life. It's a non-fictional visual novel based on my near-fatal illness when I was 18 years old. The reason why I created that game was actually because I had a friend at the time who was struggling with mental health. I wanted to create this game to show him that life is worth living, and I wanted to show him my perspective of what life is able to offer you. Now, unfortunately, the day before I finished the game, my friend took his own life, and I was never able to share this game with him. I decided to release this game for free online on platforms like GameJolt and Itch. About a month after I released the game online, I received this email from a Spanish teenager to thank me. As it turns out that he has been struggling with depression as well, and he actually has been planning to take his own life. He came across the game, and he played it, and it inspired him so much that he decided to put a stop to his plans, and he enrolled into a game design school locally. His email to me when I was a freshman in college was what really inspired me. I knew that I didn't make a single dollar off of making this game, but I may have just made a video game that saved someone's life. Wow, that's so powerful. Video games can be so powerful. What if I spent my life now just making games like that? Creating games that save other people's lives and do what I can. And that's really the foundation of why I started Serenity Forge. Serenity Forge has the mission statement that we create meaningful and emotionally impactful experiences that challenge the way you think. All of the games that we do have to be meaningful. They have to push the world forward. They have to speak things that are often unsaid. However, on top of that, we also create meaningful impact through emotions. Games that are generating strong emotions when you're playing the game, making you cry, sometimes maybe even creating trauma in hopefully positive ways. These are timeless stories. These are stories that are not lodged in a specific culture or specific background, but they are games that are made for everyone to be able to create as much positive change as possible. There's actually two very specific questions that I tend to slip into conversations when people are either sharing new game ideas or potentially pitching a new game idea to us. Imagine if you created this game, and now this game is the most popular game in the world. What kind of an impact did it have on society? What are people now thinking and doing day to day that's slightly different than the day before? And if the answer is that it's really not meant to create that kind of impact, then it's not really a Serenity Forge game. Now, on top of that, another question I like to ask people is, imagine if I were a fan of your game and I'm playing it, and somewhere in the middle, I start bawling my eyes out. There's something that happens in this game that I could never forget, that really touched me on a fundamental level. What just happened in the game for that to happen? Is that a moment that you even planned for? Is that a moment that matters, that really creates a meaningful difference? And if the answer is no, then that's not really a game for Serenity Forge either. We are here to really change the world in small, subtle ways, in ways that we can through emotional impact. Companies spend all of their time focusing on how to raise that bottom line, how to make that extra cent. It's all about the money, money, money. The way that I look at Serenity Forge is that, yes, we need money. Money is very critical. That's how we live. That's how we survive. But money is merely just a tool for us to achieve our real goals of creating meaningful change, creating meaningful difference for those around us. I can find a healthy medium between games that I want to play and games that I want to work on. Not everyone who is a creator of games has to only create games that you want to play. And I see Serenity Forge having that greater mission. One of the things that I tell Serenity Forge team members very often is that this company is never going to be about just signing games as Z likes, because I think that is, frankly, very toxic and unsustainable in creating a business that really does make a meaningful difference. So what happens at Serenity Forge instead is that we have very specific guiding principles and even a list of games that we would consider as games that are Serenity Forge games if we were given the opportunity to work on them. And I'll be frank, at least half of those games, I don't think I would actually enjoy, but those are games that create the meaningful difference that we want to see.
You're just like her.
So when I was a kid, I grew up with a lot of horror games. I loved them. They had great stories.
It's a monster!
Let me take care of this.
Some of the games that I played, such as Resident Evil or Silent Hill, they actually operate more like a resource management game where you have to manage your limited inventory space or the herbs or the bullets and the guns. So I'm a big gardener myself. I love gardening and growing my plants. I love cooking. And thinking about my day-to-day life and thinking about how that is essentially just a representation of resource management kind of helped me put the two together. I wanted to be able to think about what is the best representation of resource management. Games like farming sims or cooking sims, where you have to manage your resources and done very well from a mechanics and systems perspective. And then you kind of bring in that old school Resident Evil formula and kind of introduce the horror, introduce the deeper layers of narrative and kind of put it together. I think the thing that really inspires me the most in making games is things outside of media. I'm a huge avid gardener. I love gardening. I love cooking. And the thing that really inspired me when making Fractured Blooms are plants, of all things. In my garden, there are these weeds that just would not go away. I spent 2-3 years trying to pull them off, trying to dig up the dirt, trying to replace the dirt, just so that I can grow my own plants and grow my own tomatoes. But these weeds just come back year after year. And one day I looked at it and said, that's insane. How resilient of these plants. How crazy is it that they literally survived multiple winters and droughts and never a drop of water, yet they're still here many years later. Why can't I be that resilient? If a simple plant could do that, why can't I think about that? Fractured Blooms is a game that is built on the foundation of subversion. It is a game that you will never expect how it will hit you. When you first start the game, it comes off as this cozy life simulation, something that almost seems like a fun cottage experience, a farming sim, right? Much like games like Stardew Valley or Harvest Moon. But as you keep on going, you realize that there's more to it, that this game simulates life in ways that are both positive and negative. Because life can be complicated, and when you simulate your life, you want to simulate the whole thing. And in Fractured Blooms, we will continue to create that subversion. That this game starts off as a cozy game, but that turns into horror. But then it starts off as horror and turns into maybe something even more than that. This is a game about expanding your horizons, about breaking expectations, and ultimately learning about the price that you have to pay in order to do so. So when we make Fractured Blooms, we use real voices. And when I say that, I mean literal recordings of moments that are not meant to be heard by anyone else. These are sounds, these are visuals, these are literal memories that are created in order to tell that deep story, tell the story of that suffering, of that trauma, of the abuse that often go unheard.
This house liked to sap my strength. They picked at me, and I starved often. But tonight was going to be different.
Fractured Blooms is a game that is meant to generate conversation. It is a game where you might be done playing it once, and then you compare your notes with your friends. And then you realize that the two of you had completely, fundamentally different experiences walking out of it. This is a game where it's about empowerment. It's about
Always help out there if you need.
being able to let people speak when they're not allowed. Fractured Blooms is a game where after you're done playing this game, you might look at the characters in the game differently. You might look at colors differently. You might look at sounds or visuals differently going forward. You might see things around you that you didn't notice before. Things that you want to change, or maybe things that you wish changed but you can't. That's what really Fractured Blooms is about.
I planted the beets, then I tilled the soil. Good.
So right now, Fractured Blooms has a demo that's publicly available on Steam, so you can go download it right now. Definitely wishlist the game on Steam as well.